What if I told you that buried beneath the familiar stories of Abraham and Isaac, hidden in the shadows of Sodom's burning ruins, lies a bloodline so twisted, so stained with scandal, that its very existence should have been erased from history? Yet somehow, this cursed lineage would rise to become one of Israel's most feared enemies. For thousands of years, the world has walked past this story. Churches have whispered around its edges. Scholars have buried it in footnotes. But tonight, the silence breaks. Listen, do you hear it? The echo of ancient footsteps fleeing from fire and brimstone, the desperate whispers in a mountain cave where shame gave birth to nations. This is not a tale of heroes. This is the chronicle of Lot's sons, children conceived in darkness, born of desperation, raised in the shadow of divine judgment. From the ashes of Sodom and Gomorrah, they would build kingdoms, they would forge armies, they would curse Israel with their very breath. But here lies the mystery that will shake you to your core. How does a people born from incest, raised in betrayal, destined for destruction, somehow find themselves woven into the bloodline of the Messiah himself? The scriptures hold their breath, the stones cry out from ancient battlefields, and somewhere in the silence between judgment and mercy, God writes a story so shocking, so unexpected, that it changes everything we thought we knew about redemption. Friend, what you're about to discover isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror. Because hidden in the rise and fall of Lot's sons is a truth that pierces every broken heart, every shameful past, every seemingly irredeemable story. Even the most cursed beginnings cannot escape the reach of divine grace. Before we journey into these forbidden chapters together, I want to thank every single one of you who has supported this message through Super Thanks. Your generosity means more than you know. You're not just giving. You're helping plant seeds of light for souls who feel lost in darkness. Whether you give or simply offer your presence here tonight, I'm deeply grateful. Your heart, your time, your hunger for truth, it all matters. So I ask you this: if God could reach into the darkest cave, into the most twisted lineage, into the bloodline of his people's enemies, and still write a story of redemption, what might he be writing in the shadows of your own story right now? The cave is about to give up its secrets. Are you ready to step inside? The divine chronicles begin. Now, picture the scene, if you can bear it. The year is somewhere around 2000 BC. The sun has not yet risen, but the sky burns with unnatural light. Behind them, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are no longer cities at all. They are funeral pyres, crackling monuments to divine judgment. The very air tastes of sulfur and ash. Lot stumbles forward through the pre-dawn darkness, his daughters clinging to his arms. Their mother, she is salt now, a pillar of crystallized disobedience, frozen forever in the moment she chose to look back at what God had commanded them to leave behind. The last sounds of civilization screams, the roar of supernatural fire, the crack of stones splitting under heaven's furities fade behind them until there is only the whisper of wind through mountain stone. They find refuge in a cave. Not a grand cavern, mind you, but a wound in the earth. Cold, dark, silent. The kind of place where hope goes to die. And in that silence, something shifts. The scriptures do not soften this moment for us. Genesis 19 lays it bare with the unflinching honesty that only divine truth can bear. Listen to what unfolds in that mountain hollow, where the echo of God's judgment still rings in their ears. The daughters of Lot look around them. No cities on the horizon, no smoke rising from distant hearths, no voices calling from valley settlements. As far as their eyes can see, the world appears. Empty, dead, wiped clean by the hand of the Almighty. Our father is old, whispers the elder daughter to her sister, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. Do you hear the desperation bleeding through those words? This is not lust speaking. This is terror. The terror of extinction, of being the last, of watching a family line, perhaps even humanity itself, die with them in this forsaken cave. What would you have felt, standing in their sandals on that stone floor? Would you have trusted that somewhere beyond the horizon, life continued? Or would the silence have whispered the same lie that echoed in their hearts, that all was lost? The plan they devise is as old as desperation itself. Wine, enough wine to dull their father's senses, to cloud his judgment, to make him forget everything. The scriptures record their words with chilling precision. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. Preserve seed. Those words carry the weight of an entire civilization's continuation in their minds. They believe they are not committing sin. They believe they are saving the world. On the first night, the elder daughter approaches. The cave becomes a theater of shadows and shame. Morning comes with its cold light, and what is done cannot be undone. The second night, the younger daughter follows the same dark path. And thus, the scriptures tell us with brutal honesty, were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. The cave that should have been a refuge becomes a womb of sorrow. The fire of Sodom and Gomorrah may have stopped raining from the sky, but another kind of fire, the fire of consequences, just been kindled. It will burn through bloodlines for 1,000 years. 9 months pass. The elder daughter brings forth a son. Standing in that same cave where shame was conceived, she cradles the child and speaks a name that will echo through the corridors of history. She calls him Moab. Of my father, she whispers. The very name carries the scandal of his origin. Genesis 19:37 declares with stark finality, the same as the father of the Moabites unto this day. Unto this day. When Moses penned those words centuries later, the Moabites were not a footnote in history. They were a nation, a people, an army. The son born in scandal had become the father of multitudes. But here's what should shake us to our very foundations. This child, conceived in desperation and born in a cave of echoes, would not simply fade into obscurity. No, this bloodline would multiply like seeds scattered by a divine wind. They would build cities that rose like prayers from the earth. They would forge armies that would one day look across the Jordan River and see the descendants of Abraham camping in their thousands. The cave had become the womb of a nation. Can you see the terrible irony? Lot, who once sat in the gates of Sodom, who once entertained angels, who once walked with Abraham, this same man, in his darkest hour, becomes the unknowing patriarch of a people who will spend centuries at war with God's chosen. Yet even here, even in this moment that seems to drip with irredeemable shame, the fingerprints of sovereignty are already at work. For hidden in this bloodline, woven through its twisted beginnings, runs a scarlet thread of redemption that will one day lead. But no, that mystery must wait. Leave a comment with 77 if you've ever seen God bring redemption from a moment you thought would define you in shame. Because what happens when the son of scandal becomes the father of an army? When the child of a cave grows up to command kingdoms, the Moabites will not remain hidden in mountain shadows. They will step into the light of history, and when they do, they will carry with them both the curse of their origin and something else entirely. Something that will change everything we think we know about the reach of divine grace. Time is a master sculptor, and from the broken stone of shame, it can carve kingdoms. Picture, if you will, the morning sun cresting over the Dead Sea's crystalline waters, its light catching the limestone cliffs where something extraordinary was taking shape. Where once there had been only the echo of desperate footsteps fleeing Sodom's flames, now rose the sound of hammers on stone, voices calling across marketplaces, children laughing in streets that shouldn't exist. The sons of Lot were building. From that dark cave where scandal gave birth to nations, a people had emerged who refused to remain footnotes in someone else's story. They called themselves Moabites, and they were determined to prove that even children born of shame could raise monuments to their own glory. But can stone walls truly silence the whispers of the past? The architecture of wounded pride. East of the Dead Sea, where the earth rises in terraced plateaus toward the desert's edge, the Moabites carved their defiance into the very landscape. City by city, wall by wall, they built what we now recognize as ancient Jordan's first great civilization. Ar Moab, their fortress capital, clung to the cliffs like an eagle's nest, impregnable, proud, watching. Below it, Dibon stretched across fertile valleys, where wheat grew golden and vineyards cascaded down hillsides in ordered rows. To the north, Heshbon commanded the crossroads where caravans paused to water their camels and trade stories from distant lands. These were not crude settlements hastily thrown together by desert wanderers. These were the cities of a people who had tasted the bitter wine of rejection and decided to ferment it into something stronger. The Moabites became masters of the high places. Their temples crowned every significant hill. Their altars sent smoke signals to Chemosh, their patron goaded deity, as harsh and demanding as the circumstances that forged this nation. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems that turned arid plateaus into gardens. Their craftsmen worked copper and iron with skills that rivaled any in the ancient world. Yet beneath every cornerstone lay an unspoken question: are we building cities or hiding places? The psychology of a wounded nation. There's something profoundly human about Moab's story that echoes through every generation. Haven't we all seen it? The child marked by scandal who grows up to build the tallest walls. The family stained by shame that accumulates the most impressive possessions. The heart wounded by rejection that constructs the most elaborate defenses. Moab was a nation born from trauma, raised on survival, and educated in the school of never again. They traded with Egypt to the south, formed alliances with Ammon to the north, and always watched the western horizon where rumors stirred of a people unlike any other. A people who claimed their God split seas and rained bread from heaven. A people whose very existence seemed to whisper uncomfortable truths about divine favor and chosen destiny. The Moabites had built their identity on a simple premise: we may have been born in darkness, but we will not die in it. When nightmares take shape, then came the day that every Moabite mother had warned her children about in hushed bedtime whispers. The day their sentries climbed the watchtowers and saw something that made their blood turn to ice water in their veins. The horizon was moving. Numbers 22 opens like the first page of a horror story. The Israelites traveled to the plains of Moab and camped along the Jordan across from Jericho. But those stark words cannot capture what Balak, king of Moab, witnessed from his palace walls. Picture it through his eyes: a sea of tents stretching beyond sight, cooking fires that numbered like stars. The sound of voices raised in evening worship to a God who had humbled Egypt itself. This was not an army. This was a migration. This was the fulfillment of every nightmare that had haunted Moabite dreams since the day they first heard the name Abraham. The scriptures record Balak's terror with surgical precision. Moab was terrified because there were so many people. Indeed, Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites. Terror and dread, two words that expose the soul of a civilization built on beautiful lies. All those years of telling themselves they were strong, independent, chosen by Chemosh for greatness. And now the truth stood before them in countless campfires. They were afraid, the child born from fire. There's a profound metaphor woven through Moab's story that speaks to every human heart. Here was a people born from the literal fire of God's judgment on Sodom, children conceived in the smoke and ash of divine wrath. And what did they do with this inheritance? They tried to build a kingdom of stone that could be quarried and cut and mortared into walls, stone that felt solid under their hands, permanent under their feet, stone that whispered the lie that they could construct their own security, their own significance, their own salvation. But how do you build a foundation when your cornerstone is scandal? Every Moabite temple, every fortress wall, every trade agreement was an attempt to answer that question. They accumulated power the way wounded people accumulate proof of their worth, desperately, constantly, never quite convincingly enough. And now, spread across the plains below them, was the living reminder that some things cannot be built, only received. The sound of divine footsteps. As Balak stood on his walls, watching Israel's campfires flicker like earthbound constellations, did he understand what he was really seeing? This wasn't just a military threat. This was the sound of divine footsteps marching through history. The same God who had destroyed Sodom was now shepherding Sodom's refugees into their inheritance. The same fire that had consumed the cities of the plain was now leading their survivors toward promises older than nations. And Moab, proud Moab, civilized Moab, self-made Moab, suddenly understood that all their walls were made of sand. If you've ever seen fear dress itself up as pride, if you've ever watched someone build bigger when they're feeling smaller inside, then you understand the heart of Moab in this moment. Pride often builds walls where fear wants to hide. But what happens when the thing you fear most isn't coming to destroy you, but to reveal who you really are? Because here's what Balak couldn't have known as he counted Israel's tents and calculated impossible odds. The war that was coming wouldn't be waged with swords or siege engines. It wouldn't be fought on battlefields or decided by the strength of armies. It would begin with words that could curse or bless, and a man who claimed to speak for gods. The real battle was about to unfold in the realm of the spirit, where Moab would discover that some enemies cannot be defeated by force, and some victories cannot be purchased with gold. The curse was coming, but whose throat would it flow from? A curse that became prophecy. Picture this. Standing on the windswept heights of ancient Moab, a desperate king stares across the valley at a sight that turns his blood to ice. Spread before him like a living sea of destiny, the tents of Israel, countless as the stars Abraham was promised, countless as the grains of sand by the shore. And in that moment, King Balak of Moab realizes he is not just looking at an army, he is staring into the face of divine inevitability. But what happens when human fear collides with heavenly purpose? What unfolds when earthly kings try to manipulate the very mouth of God? The year is approximately 1400 BC. The wilderness wandering is nearly over. Moses stands ready to deliver his people into the promised land. But first, one final test. One last battle. Not of swords and shields, but of words and spirits, of curses and blessings, of ancient powers wrestling in the heavenly places. Balak, trembling in his royal robes, knows he cannot defeat Israel with conventional warfare, so he reaches into the shadows of the supernatural world, seeking a man whose words carry otherworldly power, a prophet for hire, a spiritual mercenary whose reputation spans nations. His name, Balaam. Listen carefully to what unfolds next, because what you're about to witness is not just ancient history. It's a template for how God responds when the enemies of his people try to weaponize the very realm of the spirit against them. Balaam arrives with his retinue, gold clinking in his purse, greed glinting in his eyes. Balak leads him to the high places of Baal, where 3 altars are built, 7 bulls, 7 rams, the smoke of sacrifice curling into the desert sky like the prayers of desperate men. Can you feel the tension in that moment? The crackling electricity of spiritual warfare? The weight of eternity hanging in the balance? Balaam opens his mouth to speak curses, and instead, blessings pour forth like honey from the rock. How shall I curse whom God has not cursed? How shall I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? The very words meant to destroy become declarations of divine protection. 3 times this supernatural drama repeats. 3 altars, 3 attempts, 3 stunning reversals. Each time Balak grows more desperate, more furious. Each time God transforms poison into medicine, hatred into prophecy, curses into covenant confirmations. But it is on that third height, standing on the precipice between earth and heaven, that something beyond human comprehension occurs. The Spirit of the living God descends upon Balaam with such power that the hired gun becomes heaven's mouthpiece. And from his lips, one of the most breathtaking messianic prophecies in all of Scripture. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and batter the brow of Moab. Stop. Breathe that in. A star, out of Jacob. Balaam wasn't just speaking about David's future conquests. He wasn't merely prophesying military victory. Through the mouth of a pagan soothsayer, on the soil of Israel's enemies, God unveiled the coming of Christ himself, Jesus, the bright and morning star, the scepter of righteousness, the one who would indeed strike down not just Moab, but every principality and power arrayed against the people of God. Do you see the divine irony? The mouth hired to curse Israel instead proclaimed the Messiah. This is how your God operates, beloved. When the enemy opens his mouth to destroy you, the Almighty reaches down and turns that very voice into a herald of your destiny. Think about this profound truth settling into your spirit right now. Every word spoken against you in hatred, every curse whispered in the darkness, every scheme hatched in the council chambers of your enemies. God is more than able to transform into stepping stones toward your purpose. The psalmist declared it centuries later. No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment you shall condemn. Balaam discovered that you cannot curse what God has blessed. Balak learned that human kings cannot override heavenly decrees. And standing there on those ancient heights, as the sun set over the plains of Moab, something eternal was established. Not just Israel's immediate protection, but a prophetic principle that echoes through every generation. The very forces arrayed against God's people become the platforms from which his glory is declared. But here's what will shake you to your core. This wasn't the end of Moab's story with Israel. Oh no. King Balak may have failed to curse God's people through supernatural means, But he was about to discover something far more sinister. Something that would indeed bring devastation to the camp of Israel. Not through curses, but through seduction. Comment a star emoji if you've witnessed God turn someone's curse into your confirmation. Because what we're about to uncover next will reveal how the enemy's most dangerous weapons are often wrapped in the softest packages. The battle was far from over. In fact, the deadliest assault was yet to come. The Moabites had learned something that would echo through the corridors of history like a whispered secret passed from shadow to shadow. When swords fail, when curses are turned to blessings, when even the gods themselves seem powerless against Israel's advance, there remains one weapon that has felled mighty kings and toppled righteous nations since the garden itself. Beauty, désir, the slow, sweet poison of compromise dressed in festival robes. Picture the scene as it unfolds in Numbers 25, but see it not through the eyes of history alone. See it through the eyes of eternity, where every choice reverberates like thunder across the spiritual realm. The Israelites, fresh from their victory over Balaam's cursed prophecies, their tents spread across the plains of Moab like a constellation fallen to earth, are about to discover that the most dangerous enemies don't always carry swords. They come carrying laughter. The Moabite women moved through Israel's camp like morning mist, beautiful and seemingly harmless. Their voices rang with invitation. Their eyes sparkled with promise. Their hands extended not weapons, but food, fellowship, friendship. Can you see them? Young and lovely, draped in the flowing garments of their people, bearing platters of delicacies that had never graced Hebrew tables, their smiles warm as summer rain after a long drought. Come, they whispered, share our feast, taste our joy. Why should there be walls between neighbors when there could be celebration? And Israel, mighty Israel, the nation that had watched seas split and bread fall from heaven, began to smile back. This was seduction in its most ancient and deadly form. Not the crude advance of lust, but the gentle erosion of conviction. Not the sudden fall, but the gradual drift from the sacred to the secular, from the holy to the merely pleasant. The feast tables were set not in darkness, but in broad daylight. The music that played was not the song of demons, but the laughter of neighbors. The hands that beckoned carried not daggers, but dates and honey. How many times does hell dress its deadliest traps in the clothes of innocent pleasure? At first it was only sharing a meal. What harm could there be in breaking bread with these daughters of Moab? They spoke so kindly, laughed so freely, asked for nothing but companionship. Surely this was the fruit of Israel's victory. Even their enemies sought friendship now. Surely this was evidence of God's favor spreading beyond the borders of the covenant. But feasts, like rivers, have a way of carrying those who enter them far from where they intended to go. The bread led to wine, the wine led to songs, the songs led to stories of the Moabite gods, not preached, but shared like family legends around a flickering fire. Our God Baal Peor, the women would say with reverent voices, he brings such abundance to our harvests, such joy to our festivals. Perhaps your God and ours are not so different. And there, in that whispered suggestion, lay the serpent's ancient lie, surely you will not die. The scriptures record the moment of fall with devastating simplicity. And Israel joined himself unto Baal. Peor, not conquered, not forced, not dragged, screaming into idolatry, joined. As a man joins himself to a woman in marriage, Israel bound herself to this foreign god with the sacred cords of worship. Picture the horror of that first Hebrew man kneeling before a Moabite altar. See the tears of heaven as the people who had sung, "The Lord is my shepherd," now lifted their voices to stone carved by human hands. Feel the trembling of creation itself, as those who bore the mark of circumcision, the sign of their covenant with the Almighty, now bore the mark of ash from heathen fires upon their foreheads. 24,000. That's the number that burns like brand across the pages of Numbers 25. 24,000 Israelites fell under God's plague in a single day, not in battle, not to enemy swords, but to the judgment of the very God who had delivered them from Egypt, fed them in the wilderness, and promised them a land flowing with milk and honey. Can you hear the silence that must have fallen across that camp? Where moments before there had been laughter and music and the clinking of cups raised in toast, now there was only the sound of weeping and the whispered prayers of those who suddenly remembered who they were and what they had done. The beauty that had beckoned them to feast had led them to famine. The smiles that had promised pleasure had delivered death. The hands that had offered friendship had bound them in chains they never saw coming. This is the mystery that still haunts every human heart. How easily we trade the eternal for the immediate, the sacred for the satisfying, the presence of God for the applause of men. And somewhere in the hills overlooking that devastated camp, the princes of Moab must have looked down with bitter satisfaction. What their armies could not accomplish, their daughters had achieved in a single season. What curses could not bring about, compromise had delivered in abundance. They had learned the oldest lesson in the devil's playbook. You don't have to destroy God's people if you can simply get them to destroy themselves. But even in this darkest hour, even as judgment fell like hail upon Israel's tents, the story was far from over, because hidden in the shadows of this tragedy, something else was stirring. A remnant that would not bow, a people within the people who remembered their God even when surrounded by those who had forgotten him. And what happens when a nation like Moab thinks it has finally won, only to discover it has been playing a game whose rules were written by a God they never understood? The silence of judgment was about to give way to something else entirely, something that would shake the very foundations of Moab's confidence and reveal that even their greatest victory was merely another verse in a song they had never learned to read. The pride that drew down fire. Prophets weep over a nation that refuses to bow. There comes a moment in every nation's story when the cup of divine patience finally overflows. For centuries, Moab had watched from their mountain fortresses as empires rose and fell. They had seen Egypt humbled, Babylon crushed, Assyria scattered to the winds. Yet somehow, in their limestone citadels, carved into the cliffs above the Dead Sea, they whispered to themselves the lie that has destroyed every kingdom since the dawn of time. We are different. We are untouchable. We will never fall. But pride, my friend, is not just a sin. It is a spiritual cancer that spreads through the soul of nations until it reaches the very throne room of heaven itself. And when it does, when the Creator of all things hears the echo of that ancient rebellion that once whispered, "I will be like the Most High," the response is not delayed. It is devastating. Picture the scene as it unfolds in Jeremiah chapter 48. The prophet stands alone on a windswept hill, his eyes wet with tears that are not his own. For 24 hours, the Spirit of the Lord has been pouring through him like molten bronze, revealing the fate of a nation that had grown drunk on its own arrogance. And what Jeremiah sees is not just political conquest. It is divine surgery. We have heard the pride of Moab, thunders the voice of God through trembling lips. He is exceeding proud, his loftiness and his arrogancy, and his pride and the haughtiness of his heart. Can you feel it? That moment when heaven itself seems to recoil at the spiritual stench rising from a people who had forgotten they were dust? Moab had not simply grown wealthy. They had grown contemptuous. They had not just built cities. They had built altars to their own glory. And when Israel stumbled under Babylon's chains, when Jerusalem's walls cracked and her children wept in exile, Moab laughed. They pointed. They mocked. They raided the borders of a wounded people as if Israel's agony were entertainment for their festivals. Was not Israel a derision unto thee? God asks with a voice that makes mountains tremble, was he found among thieves? For since thou spakest of him, thou skippedest for joy. Skipped for joy. Let that phrase settle into your spirit. Like a stone, dropped into still water. When God's chosen people were bleeding, Moab was dancing. When the covenant nation was in chains, Moab was celebrating. They had forgotten the most dangerous truth in all of human history. He who touches Israel touches the apple of God's eye, and so the judgment begins to fall. But this is not the swift sword of human conquest. This is something far more terrifying. This is the slow, inexorable grinding of divine justice. God speaks through Jeremiah like a master vintner, surveying vineyards that must be torn up by the roots. O vine of Sibmah, I will weep for thee. Thy plants are gone over the sea, they reach even to the sea of Jazer. The spoiler is fallen upon thy summer fruits and upon thy vintage. Can you see it? Those terraced hillsides where Moab's wine had once flowed like liquid gold, shipped to the markets of Tyre and Damascus, now trampled under the boots of foreign armies. The very earth that had fed their pride becomes the stage for their humiliation. And joy and gladness is taken from the plentiful field and from the land of Moab, and I have caused wine to fail from the winepresses. None shall tread with shouting. their shouting shall be no shouting. The silence that follows is not the silence of peace, it is the silence of death. Where once the harvest songs echoed across the valleys, now only the wind moans through abandoned cities. The laughter that had mocked Israel's tears becomes the wailing of mothers who search for children that will never come home. But God is not finished. Moab shall be destroyed from being a people, because he hath magnified himself against the Lord. Destroyed from being a people, not defeated, not conquered, not occupied. Destroyed from being a people, erased so completely that their very name would become a whisper in the archives of history. Their language forgotten, their customs scattered, their bloodline absorbed into the surrounding nations until no trace remained of the kingdom that once boasted it would outlast the stars. And history itself becomes the witness to prophecy's precision. The Assyrians came first, their iron chariots crushing Moab's cities like eggs beneath a hammer. Then Babylon's armies swept across the land like a prairie fire, leaving nothing but ash and silence. Under Persia, Moab became a province. Under Greece, a footnote. Under Rome, a memory. By the time Christ walked the dusty roads of Palestine, the name Moab existed only on crumbling monuments and in the scrolls of prophets who had wept over their destruction centuries before it came to pass. But here is where the story takes a turn that will stop your breath. Because even as God's judgment was falling like hammer blows upon the cities of Moab, even as their vineyards were being trampled and their people scattered like leaves before an autumn wind, there was one heart in all that cursed land that had already turned away from the altars of pride. Her name was Ruth. And through her, through this one humble soul who chose Yahweh over Chemosh, who chose loyalty over comfort, who chose faith over fear, God was already writing the first chapter of redemption that would echo all the way to a stable in Bethlehem. From the ashes of judgment would rise a whisper of redemption, because the God who crushed Moab's pride is the same God who lifts up the humble, and the story of how he can reach even into the ruins of judgment to plant seeds of grace. That story is far from over. But here, in the midst of judgment and ruin, in the shadow of nations, crushed by their own pride, something stirred that would shake heaven itself. A single heartbeat, a whispered vow, a choice that would rewrite the bloodline of eternity. Her name was Ruth, a Moabitess, daughter of the very people who had seduced Israel into idolatry, whose altars had reeked with the smoke of false gods, whose pride had invited divine wrath across their cities. And yet, listen carefully, because what you're about to witness defies every law of spiritual genetics, every rule of divine justice, every expectation of how God writes his stories. The famine had driven Elimelech and his family from Bethlehem into the foreign fields of Moab. There, in that cursed land, his sons took wives from among the daughters of Chemosh, Orpah, and Ruth. For a brief moment, it seemed life might bloom again in exile. But death is patient, and it came calling. Within a decade, every man in that Hebrew household had been gathered to his fathers. Elimelech, Mahlon, Chilion, gone, leaving 3 widows to weep in a land that was not their own. Picture Naomi, her face carved by grief. Calling herself Meribitteress, she prepared to return to Bethlehem with empty hands and an emptier heart. She urged her daughters-in-law to remain in Moab, to rebuild their lives among their own people, their own gods. Orpah wept, kissed Naomi farewell, and turned back to the familiar altars of her fathers. But Ruth stood at the crossroads of eternity itself. "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee," she whispered, her voice trembling with something that sounded less like loyalty and more like prophecy. "For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God. Where thou diest, will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." Do you hear it? The sound of chains breaking, the whisper of divine adoption echoing across the centuries. In that single vow, Ruth didn't just choose a new family, she chose a new God. She renounced Chemosh and every altar of Moab. She crossed an invisible line that separated the covenant people from the nations. She became Israel, a flower blooming from cursed soil. Back in Bethlehem, Ruth learned what it meant to live on the margins, a Moabitess, a widow, a foreigner gleaning grain behind the harvesters, picking up the fragments that fell from richer hands. But oh, what divine orchestration was unfolding in those dusty fields. The land belonged to Boaz, a man of wealth, of honor, of the very lineage of Judah. And when his eyes fell upon this foreign woman bent low among the sheaves, he saw something that stopped his heart. Not just beauty, not just diligence. He saw faith that had crossed every boundary to find its home. "The Lord recompense thy work," he spoke over her, "and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust." Under whose wings thou art come to trust. Can you see it? This woman who had once bowed before the stone gods of Moab was now sheltered beneath the wings of the Almighty. The same wings that had covered the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies. The same divine presence that had led Israel through the wilderness. Through the ancient law of kinsman redeemer, Boaz purchased not just Naomi's inheritance, but Ruth's future. That despised Moabitess became the cherished bride of a prince in Israel. Her shame was swallowed by honor. Her foreignness was clothed in belonging. And from their union, listen carefully to what heaven whispered next. "And Ruth bare Obed." Pause. Let that name settle into your spirit. Obed. "And Obed begat Jesse." Jesse, can you feel the tremor in the spiritual realm? "And Jesse begot David." David, the shepherd king, the man after God's own heart, the one whose throne would be established forever. From the twisted cave of Lot's shame, through the judgment of proud Moab, through the humility of one foreign woman who dared to trust, God had woven a scarlet thread that would lead directly to Bethlehem's stable. When Matthew opens his gospel with the genealogy of Jesus Christ, he names only 4 women: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, each one an outsider, each one scarred by scandal or foreignness, each one a reminder that God's grace reaches into the most unlikely bloodlines. Ruth the Moabitess, her name forever inscribed in the lineage of the Messiah. Do you understand what this means? The same God who judged Moab for its pride, who crushed its cities for their arrogance, who scattered its people for their rebellion, took one humble heart and grafted it into the very bloodstream of redemption. The DNA of Jesus Christ carried Moabite blood. The King of Kings descended from the daughter of his people's enemies. The Prince of Peace was born from a lineage that included the most despised of nations. This is not just history. This is hope, right? Redeemed, if you believe God can pull beauty from your bloodline. Because if God could reach into the cursed soil of Moab and bring forth a flower that would bloom in David's garden, if he could take a foreign woman and make her the great-grandmother of Israel's greatest king, if he could weave even the threads of scandal and shame into the tapestry of salvation, what might he be preparing to do with the broken pieces of your own story? But this was not the end of Moab. It was the beginning of something divine, because the same grace that reached down to lift up Ruth would soon echo across centuries in a voice that would thunder from Judean hills. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And the rest of this story will leave you breathless. There is a silence in history that speaks louder than the clash of swords, a vanishing that echoes more powerfully than the proudest monuments. Tonight, we step into that sacred quiet, where a nation disappears from the map, yet rises into eternity itself. The final curtain was falling on Moab's stage. By the time Roman legions marched across the ancient Near East, the name that once struck terror into Israel's heart had become little more than a whisper in the wind. No more kings bearing crowns in the high places of Chemosh. No more armies gathering on the plains where Balak once summoned Balaam to curse God's chosen people. But here lies the mystery that makes the stones themselves cry out. How does a nation vanish from every earthly record, yet find itself written into the very bloodstream of the Messiah? Picture the slow dissolution. Like salt dissolving in water, the remaining Moabites were quietly absorbed into the shifting tribes of Ammon, Edom, and the wandering peoples of Arabia. Conquest after conquest had scattered them like leaves before an autumn wind. The Assyrians came first, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, then Rome itself. Each empire ground a little more of Moab's identity into the dust of history. Can you feel it? the eerie silence where once proud voices had sung hymns to false gods. By the dawn of the Christian era, travelers passing through the lands east of the Dead Sea would find only ruins, broken walls that once echoed with the laughter of children, empty marketplaces where merchants had once called out their wares. The very stones seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting for someone to remember the names carved upon them. Yet in God's economy, nothing truly vanishes. Nothing is ever truly lost. For while men were erasing Moab from their maps, heaven was preserving something far more precious than kingdoms or crowns: the DNA of redemption. Think about this stunning reversal. The same soil that had bred rebellion against the Most High, the same lineage that had seduced Israel into idolatry, the same bloodline that had mocked when Jerusalem fell. Somehow, mysteriously, miraculously, had contributed to the genealogy of Jesus Christ himself. Through Ruth, through that one humble Moabite woman who had left everything she knew to cling to the God of Israel. Her choice in that dusty field outside Bethlehem had planted a seed that would grow into the tree of life itself. Do you see the divine artistry in this? The way God takes what was meant for destruction and transforms it into the very vessel of salvation? The ancient rabbis understood something profound about this mystery. In their sacred discussions, they spoke of how the Messiah would come not from the pure and the proud, but from the broken and the redeemed. They saw in Ruth's story a preview of the gospel itself, that God's grace would reach beyond the boundaries of blood and birth, beyond the walls of nation and tradition, to embrace even the children of Lot's shame. And so Moab's vanishing became its victory. Their disappearance from history became their entrance into eternity. But the silence holds another secret. In the prophetic books, Moab's name doesn't simply fade away. It lingers like an echo in a canyon, appearing in visions of the end times. Isaiah speaks of Moab's eventual restoration. Jeremiah weeps over their judgment, yet hints at mercy in the latter days. Even in the apocalyptic imagery of Revelation, some scholars see shadows of ancient enemies being transformed into worshippers at the throne of the Lamb. Could it be that Moab's story isn't finished? That their vanishing was not an ending, but a transformation? Consider this haunting possibility. What if the very peoples who today inhabit the lands where Moab once flourished, the Jordanians, the Palestinians, the scattered tribes of the Middle East, what if some of them carry the genetic memory of those ancient Moabites? What if Ruth's distant cousins still walk the earth, unknowing that their ancestors once stood in the courts of Chemosh? And what if God, in his perfect timing, is preparing even now to complete the story? He began in that cave outside Sodom. What if the blood of Moab that flows through Christ's lineage is still calling to the blood of Moab that flows through modern veins? The silence whispers prophecy. For in God's kingdom, nothing is ever truly erased. Every tear is remembered. Every broken dream is being restored. Every lost name is written in the Lamb's book of life. This is why Moab's story matters to you tonight. Because maybe you felt erased too. Maybe your family name carries shame instead of honor. Maybe your lineage is marked by failure instead of faith. Maybe you've watched your dreams crumble like ancient walls and wondered if you'll be forgotten by history. But listen to what the silence is telling you. The same God who reached into Moab's ruins and pulled out a thread of redemption that leads straight to the cross, that same God sees you, knows your name, remembers your tears, and he's still writing stories of restoration that will echo through eternity. From the ashes of scandal, he births salvation. From the dust of defeat, he raises dynasties. From the silence of the forgotten, he speaks words that shake the foundations of heaven and earth. Moab fell on the maps of men, but rose in the genealogy of God. And your story, it's not finished either, because the God who remembers names that history forgets is still calling yours. But wait, the story doesn't end in ashes. Even as we stand here, watching the dust settle over Moab's broken walls, even as we hear the final echoes of their name fade from history's pages, something stirs in the shadows of prophecy, a whisper, a promise, a crack of light bleeding through the darkness of divine judgment. Because God never writes a story with only one ending. Turn with me now to Jeremiah 49, verses 34 through 39. Here, buried in the middle of one of Scripture's most devastating judgments, lies a mystery that has puzzled theologians for millennia. The prophet's pen trembles as he writes about Elam, Moab's ancient kin, their spiritual cousins in the land we now call Iran. I will break the bow of Elam, the mainstay of their might. The judgment is swift, merciless, final. Elam's military power would be shattered like pottery thrown against stone, their people scattered to the four winds, their pride crushed beneath the weight of divine wrath. But then, just when we think the sentence is complete, when we expect the scroll to roll closed on another tale of judgment, Jeremiah's hand moves again. And what flows from his pen defies every expectation, every precedent, every reasonable assumption about God's justice. Yet it will come to pass in the latter days that I will bring back the captives of Elam, says the Lord. In the latter days, I will restore. Do you feel that? That shiver running down your spine? That sense that we've just stumbled upon something too wonderful, too impossible to be true? God himself, the same God who scattered Elam's children like leaves in a hurricane, promises to gather them again. In the latter days, those three words hang in the air like incense, like a prayer half spoken, like a secret too sacred for ordinary conversation. What could this mean? What are these latter days that Jeremiah speaks of with such prophetic certainty? Could it be that somewhere in the timeline of eternity, God has marked a moment when even the most judged, the most scattered, the most forgotten peoples would hear their names called again? But here's where the mystery deepens. Elam and Moab, these were not random nations scattered across the ancient map. They were connected by blood, by geography, by the same spiritual DNA that traced back to those shadowy caves outside Sodom. They shared the same curse. They carried the same shame. They bore the same judgment. And if God promised restoration for Elam, what might that mean for Moab? Stand with me for a moment. In the modern land of Jordan, where Moab's ancient cities once stood proud, walk through the refugee camps where displaced souls from Syria, Iraq, and Palestine seek shelter. Listen to the whispered prayers rising from underground churches where former Muslims bow their knees to Jesus in secret. Could it be? Could revival be stirring in the very soil where judgment once fell? There are reports, quiet testimonies that slip like shadows through missionary networks, of dreams and visions sweeping through the Middle East, former enemies of Israel awakening to find Jesus standing at the foot of their beds, ancient bloodlines that once cursed Abraham's children now weeping over the cross. Is this what Jeremiah saw? This impossible reversal? This divine alchemy that turns curses into blessings? Think about it. Think about the sheer audacity of grace. The same God who judged Moab for their pride, who scattered Elam for their rebellion, who allowed their names to fade from the maps of empire. This same God whispers through his prophets, I will restore, not because they deserved it, not because they earned it, not because justice demanded it, but because mercy. Mercy is God's favorite surprise. And here's the truth that should stop our hearts with wonder. God leaves a crack in every wall of judgment for mercy to enter, even in his most devastating pronouncements, even in his fiercest wrath, even when he speaks words that topple kingdoms and scatter nations. Somewhere in the rubble, he plants a seed. Somewhere in the ashes, he hides a promise. Even Moab, even the children of that dark cave, even they are not beyond the reach of latter-day restoration. But what does this mean for your story? Because if God can promise restoration to Elam, if he can plant hope in the ruins of Moab, if he can look at the most cursed bloodlines and whisper, I will restore, then what walls of judgment in your life might already have cracks where mercy is waiting to break through? What scattered pieces of your story might God be preparing to gather in his latter days? The mystery of Moab's return isn't just ancient history. It's present hope. It's the promise that no judgment is God's final word. No curse is beyond his power to reverse. No bloodline is too stained for his grace to purify. So pray for those who carry the spiritual DNA of Moab today. Pray for the underground churches rising in Jordan's hills. Pray for revival to sweep through the lands where judgment once fell. Because sometimes God's greatest victories come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the very soil where curses were planted becomes the garden where miracles bloom. And so we arrive at the end of this ancient chronicle. Yet perhaps it is not an ending at all, but a beginning. For in the dust of Moab's fallen cities, in the silence where their proud voices once rang, echoes a truth that reaches across millennia, to touch the very chambers of your heart. Listen carefully, friend. The story of Moab is not merely history buried beneath Jordanian sands. It is prophecy written in flesh and blood. It is your story and mine, spelled out in the rise and ruin of a people who dared to believe they could stand against the living God. Do you see it now? The terrible beauty of it all? From the shadowed cave where Lot's daughters conceived children in desperation, to the proud towers of Ar rising defiantly from clifftop stone, to the humble fields of Bethlehem, where Ruth gleaned behind the reapers. This has always been about more than ancient kingdoms. This has been about the human heart, about every soul born into brokenness, raised in rebellion, yet still called by name. You are Moab, born perhaps not from incest, but from some other shame that shadows your lineage, shaped not by idol worship, but by other altars where you've knelt. Success, approval, comfort, control. You've felt the intoxicating pull of pride, the whisper that says you need no one, not even God. You've mocked when others fell, struck when they were wounded, built walls when you should have built bridges. But you are also Ruth, standing at the crossroads between what was and what could be, holding in your trembling hands the choice that will define not just your destiny, but the legacy you leave behind. Will you cling to the familiar gods that cannot speak, cannot save, cannot transform? Or will you step into the terrifying beauty of surrender? Because here's what Moab's story whispers to every broken heart tonight. The same God who judged their pride also reached into their ruins. The same hand that toppled their altars also lifted a widow from their dust. The same voice that pronounced their doom also wove their redemption into the bloodline of the Messiah himself. Think of it. A Moabite woman, gleaning grain in Bethlehem fields, her calloused hands gathering scattered stalks, while heaven's plan gathered around her. She could never have imagined that her great-great-grandson would tend sheep in those same hills, writing psalms by moonlight, that from her surrendered life would flow the lineage of kings. But God sees what we cannot see. He writes legacies from ashes. He crafts crowns from clay. And tonight, as you sit in the glow of your screen, wrestling perhaps with your own shadows, your own shame, your own sense that you've wandered too far or fallen too hard, remember this. You are not just the reader of this story. You are the parchment God is still writing on. Every regret, every failure, every moment you felt too broken to be beautiful, these are not the end of your story. They are the raw material from which God crafts his most stunning redemptions. The prophet Jeremiah saw it clearly when he wrote, "Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is there anything too hard for me?" The answer echoes through Moab's ruins, through Ruth's courage, through David's psalms, through Christ's empty tomb. Nothing. Nothing is too hard for him. Your family's dysfunction, your personal battles, your secret struggles, your public failures, none of these disqualify you from the story God is writing. If anything, they qualify you. Because grace doesn't come to the deserving, it comes to the desperate. The same God who broke Moab's pride to redeem her womb, the same power that humbled their arrogance, lifted their remnant into royalty. And he can do it for you. Not because you've earned it, not because you've cleaned yourself up or gotten your act together, but because that's who he is. The God who calls things that are not as though they were, who speaks life into dead places, who writes beauty from brokenness. So what will it be tonight? Will you walk away from this ancient story unchanged, still convinced your past defines your future? Or will you dare to believe that the God who transformed a Moabite widow into the grandmother of kings is not finished with your story either? The cave is behind you, the altar stones are crumbling, the field is before you, and the kinsman redeemer is watching. Your move, child of promise, your move. And so the ancient scroll closes, yet the ink is still wet. The fire that once consumed Sodom still burns. The pride that toppled Moab's towers still whispers. The grace that lifted Ruth from gleaning fields still reaches. We began this journey in a cave where shame gave birth to nations. We watched kingdoms rise from scandal, armies march from betrayal, and judgment fall like thunder from heaven's throne. Yet through it all, threading its way through incest and idolatry, through pride and prophecy runs a scarlet cord of redemption that refuses to be broken. Do you see it now? This was never just about ancient peoples with unpronounceable names. This was about the human heart, about bloodlines that carry both curse and calling, about the mysterious ways God writes his story through the most unlikely vessels. The Moabites are gone, Their cities lie buried beneath Jordanian sand. Their altars to Chemosh have crumbled into dust. Yet their story breathes still, because it lives in every heart that has ever chosen pride over humility, rebellion over surrender, the familiar over the faithful. But here is the wonder that should stop our breath. The same God who pronounced judgment upon Moab's arrogance reached down into their ruins and lifted out a widow named Ruth. From their cursed lineage, he crafted a royal bloodline. From their ashes, he raised the throne of David. From their shame, he authored salvation's song. What does this tell us about the hour we are living in? Look around you, friend. The headlines speak of ancient hatreds awakening. Nations that once trembled before Israel's God now rage against his people. The spirit of Moab, that ancient pride, that mocking laughter, that defiant fist raised toward heaven, walks the earth again, wearing modern faces, speaking through digital tongues. Yet prophecy is not finished. The scroll still unrolls. We are not merely observers of ancient history. We are participants in its continuation. Every choice we make echoes across eternity. Every moment of surrender writes another verse in the song that began when Ruth said, "Your God shall be my God." Every act of pride adds another stone to towers that God will one day topple. The question that hangs in the sacred silence tonight is this: which lineage are you choosing? The bloodline of Balak who cursed, or Boaz who redeemed? The heritage of Chemosh who demanded sacrifice, or Christ who became the sacrifice? For we too stand at crossroads. We too hear whispers in the darkness. We too must choose between the cave and the field, between hiding in shame and gleaning in grace. And perhaps this is why these ancient stories refuse to stay buried. Perhaps this is why the dust of Moab still speaks, why the silence of their cities still echoes. Because somewhere in their rise and ruin, we glimpse the outline of our own destiny. The God who humbled the proud lifts up the humble. The God who judges rebellion redeems surrender. The God who scattered the arrogant gathers the broken. He has not changed. His arm is not shortened. His mercy is not exhausted. So as the final words of this chronicle fade into sacred silence, remember this: you are not just reading about history, you are living in it. The same spiritual forces that shaped Moab's fate are shaping yours. The same choice that transformed Ruth's destiny stands before you tonight. Will you be remembered as one who stood against God's purposes, or one who surrendered to them? The scroll awaits your answer. The ink is ready, and God is still writing. In the end, when all the kingdoms have fallen and all the pride has been humbled, only one question will matter. Did you choose the cave, or did you choose the field? The silence holds your answer, and eternity is listening.